The world before Noah. Before delving into the story of Noah's Ark, it is crucial to understand the moral and spiritual state of the world before the flood. The early chapters of Genesis paint a picture of a world in disarray. The descendants of Adam and Eve had multiplied and spread across the earth. However, with this increase in population came an increase in wickedness. Humanity, designed to live in harmony with God, had strayed far from its intended path. In Genesis 6:5, we read that, "The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually." The degradation of morality was not just limited to acts of evil, it permeated the hearts and minds of humanity. This widespread rebellion against God led to chaos, violence, and disorder in the world. The Creator was grieved by what he saw, and the relationship between God and humanity was severely broken. However, amidst this bleak picture of humanity, Noah stood out as a beacon of righteousness. Genesis 6:9 describes Noah as a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. While the world was drowning in sin, Noah was a man who maintained a close relationship with God, setting the stage for the events to come. God's grief and decision to judge the earth. God's grief over humanity's rebellion is one of the most profound emotional moments in the story of Noah. In Genesis 6:6, we are told that the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. God, in his infinite holiness, could not overlook the rampant sin that had corrupted the earth. Yet this grief was not out of anger alone, but sorrow, reflecting the deep relationship God intended to have with humanity. Because of the overwhelming corruption, God made a decision. "I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them." Genesis 6:7. The flood was not an impulsive act of vengeance, but a divine decision to cleanse the earth from its pervasive wickedness. However, even in judgment, God's plan for redemption and renewal began to unfold through Noah. The call of Noah. Amid the chaos of the pre-flood world, God chose Noah to carry out a mission of preservation. Noah was chosen because of his faith and obedience. This divine call wasn't just about Noah's personal righteousness, but also his role in God's plan to preserve a remnant of humanity and animal life. In Genesis 6:13-14, God said to Noah, "I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood." This was an extraordinary task, given that Noah likely had no prior experience in shipbuilding. Yet God provided detailed instructions, which Noah followed with unwavering faith. Noah's response to God's call demonstrates profound obedience. The text does not record any hesitation or doubt on Noah's part. Despite the monumental nature of the task, his willingness to obey, even when the world around him mocked or misunderstood, marks him as a man of great faith. The design of the ark. The ark was not a small vessel. In fact, the dimensions of the ark as outlined in Genesis 6:15 were immense: 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. In modern measurements, this would translate to approximately 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet tall. This massive structure was designed to house Noah's family and representatives of all the animal species God wished to preserve. The ark was built from gopher wood and was to have rooms and decks to accommodate all the creatures. Noah was also instructed to cover the ark inside and out with pitch to ensure its waterproofing. This level of detail in the ark's construction demonstrates that God's plan was not haphazard. Every aspect of the ark was meticulously designed for survival in the midst of the greatest catastrophe the earth had ever seen. This design also speaks to the symbolism of the ark itself. It was not just a physical structure, but a symbol of salvation, providing refuge from the waters of judgment. Many theologians later draw parallels between the ark and the church, seeing it as a metaphor for the salvation offered by God through faith and obedience. The gathering of the animals. One of the most memorable aspects of the Noah's Ark story is the gathering of the animals. God instructed Noah to bring pairs of every kind of living creature into the ark so that they could be preserved from the flood and repopulate the earth afterward. Genesis 6:19-20 says, You are to bring into the ark 2 of all living creatures, male and female, to keep them alive with you. 2 of every kind of bird, of every kind of animal, and of every kind of creature that moves along the ground will come to you to be kept alive. The image of animals, from lions to sparrows, from elephants to lizards, boarding the ark 2 by 2 is both awe-inspiring and mysterious. How exactly Noah gathered these creatures is not detailed in the text, but it is clear that God orchestrated the process. The animals came to Noah, an indication of divine intervention, showing God's sovereignty over creation. This gathering of animals has deep theological significance. It highlights God's care for all of his creation, not just humanity. While the flood was a means of judgment for sin, God still desired to preserve the diversity of life that he had created. The sealing of the ark. Once Noah, his family, and the animals were safely aboard the ark, God himself sealed them inside. Genesis 7:16 tells us, "Then the Lord shut him in." This small detail carries immense meaning. By shutting the door, God was the one who provided ultimate protection. No human hand could secure the ark against the floodwaters. It was God's hand alone that safeguarded those inside. The sealing of the ark also symbolizes the finality of God's judgment. Once the door was closed, those outside were left to face the consequences of their rebellion. The opportunity for repentance had passed, and the flood was about to begin. The beginning of the flood. The flood began in dramatic fashion. Genesis 7:11-12 describes the event. On that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened, and rain fell upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. This was not merely a heavy rainstorm. It was a cataclysmic event, with water pouring down from above and surging up from below. The language used in this passage suggests a complete undoing of the created order. In Genesis 1, God separated the waters above from the waters below to create the habitable world. Now in the flood, these waters were released and the boundaries were erased. The floodwaters covered the earth, reversing the act of creation and symbolizing a return to chaos. 40 days and 40 nights. For 40 days and 40 nights, the rain continued unabated. This period of time is significant in the Bible, as the number 40 often represents a time of testing, trial, and purification. In this case, it was the period during which the earth was cleansed of its wickedness. Inside the ark, Noah, his family, and the animals waited in faith, trusting that God would see them through this period of judgment. The 40 days and 40 nights also echo later biblical events, such as the 40 years the Israelites spent in the wilderness and the 40 days Jesus fasted in the desert. In each case, the period of 40 symbolizes a time of testing, followed by renewal and blessing. The earth covered in water. The floodwaters rose until they covered the highest mountains on earth. Genesis 7:19-20 tells us, "And the waters prevailed so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep." This description underscores the totality of the flood. Nothing was left untouched by the waters. The image of the earth submerged in water is a powerful symbol of both destruction and potential for rebirth. In many ancient cultures, water represented chaos, but it was also seen as the source of life. The flood, then, can be understood as both an act of destruction and a necessary precursor to the renewal of creation. The preservation of life in the ark. While the earth outside the ark was destroyed, the ark itself floated above the waters, preserving the life within. The text emphasizes that every living thing outside the ark perished, but Noah and those with him were kept safe. The ark, therefore, becomes a powerful symbol of God's mercy and grace. The safety of those within the ark also highlights the theme of divine protection. Noah and his family were not spared from the flood because of their own strength or ingenuity, but because of God's faithfulness to his promise. The waters begin to recede. After 150 days, the waters began to recede. Genesis 8:1 tells us, "But God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark. And God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided." The use after the earth had been submerged under the floodwaters for 150 days, a pivotal moment occurs. God remembered Noah and all those who were with him in the ark. The phrase God remembered in Genesis 8:1 is not about God having forgotten them, but rather a turning point in the story. This moment signifies God's active intervention to bring the flood to an end. It marks the transition from judgment to restoration, from destruction to renewal. It shows God's continued care for his creation, especially for those he had chosen to preserve. In response to this remembrance, God made a wind blow over the earth and the waters subsided. Genesis 8:1. This divine wind parallels the Spirit of God that hovered over the waters during the original act of creation in Genesis 1:2. Just as God brought order to the primordial chaos at the beginning of creation, he now begins the process of restoring order after the flood. The chaos of the flood waters, which had enveloped the earth, starts to recede through God's command. Over time, the flood waters slowly diminished. The Bible gives specific markers for this process. On the 17th day of the 7th month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. Genesis 8:4. These mountains are traditionally understood to be located in modern-day Turkey, though the precise location remains a mystery and a topic of much speculation. By the first day of the 10th month, the tops of the mountains could be seen. Genesis 8:5. This is significant because it represents the first visual evidence that the waters were truly receding, a sign of hope after months of confinement inside the ark. During this time, Noah and his family remained in the ark, waiting patiently for God's instruction to leave. Though the tops of the mountains were visible, Noah knew that the earth was not yet ready for them to emerge. The process of restoration and renewal would take time, and Noah demonstrated his continued faith and obedience by remaining in the ark until God gave the signal. Noah sends out the raven and the dove. As the flood waters continued to recede, Noah began to explore whether the earth was dry enough for them to leave the ark. In Genesis 8:6-7, Noah first sent out a raven. The raven went to and fro until the waters were dried up from the earth. The Bible does not mention the raven returning to the ark, suggesting that it may have found perches on the mountaintops or other high places as the waters receded. The raven, being a scavenger, could survive in conditions that were still too harsh for other creatures, hence it did not return to the ark. Noah then decided to send out a dove, which was more sensitive to the condition of the land. In Genesis 8:8-9, we read, "Then he sent forth a dove from him to see if the waters had subsided from the face of the ground. But the dove found no place to set her foot, and she returned to him to the ark, for the waters were still on the face of the whole earth." This first flight of the dove indicated that the earth was not yet habitable, confirming Noah's need for continued patience. Noah waited another 7 days before sending the dove out again. This time, the dove returned with a freshly plucked olive leaf. Genesis 8:11. The olive leaf was a significant sign. It indicated not only that the waters had receded further, but also that life was beginning to re-emerge on the earth. The olive tree is known to grow in lower altitudes and to be one of the first plants to regrow after a flood. So this small leaf symbolized the resilience of creation and the renewal of the earth. Finally, Noah waited another 7 days and sent the dove out again. This time, the dove did not return. Genesis 8:12 says, "So he waited another 7 days and sent forth the dove, and she did not return to him anymore." The dove's failure to return signified that the earth had sufficiently dried, and it was now possible for Noah, his family, and the animals to leave the ark. The raven and dove are often seen as symbolic in biblical interpretation. The raven, which did not return, is sometimes associated with impurity and the inability to discern God's timing, while the dove, returning with an olive branch, has become a universal symbol of peace, hope, and restoration. The earth dries up. After the dove's final flight, Noah waited another period of time before taking action. Genesis 8:13 records that by the first day of the first month of Noah's 601st year, the waters had dried from the earth. Noah removed the covering of the ark and saw that the ground was dry. This was a powerful moment of revelation. After over a year confined within the ark, Noah and his family could finally see the earth that had been submerged and ravaged by the flood. However, despite the dry ground, Noah continued to wait for God's command before leaving the ark. It wasn't until the 27th day of the second month, over a month after Noah first saw the dry land, that God finally spoke to him. This shows Noah's continued faith and obedience. Even when all signs pointed to the possibility of leaving the ark, he waited patiently for divine guidance. God's command to exit the ark. In Genesis 8:15-16, God spoke to Noah, saying, "Go out from the ark, you and your wife, and your sons' wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing that is with you of all flesh, birds and animals and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, that they may swarm on the earth and be fruitful and multiply on the earth." With this command, God signaled that the time of judgment was over and the time for renewal and repopulation had begun. Noah, his family, and all the animals exited the ark and stepped onto a transformed world, a world washed clean by the floodwaters and ready for a fresh start. Noah's obedience, patience, and faith had been rewarded. He had faithfully followed God's instructions to build the ark, gather the animals, and endure the long months of the flood. And now he was called to participate in the rebuilding of creation. Noah's sacrifice and worship. Noah's first action upon exiting the ark was one of worship and thanksgiving. Genesis 8:20 says, "Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and took some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar." This act of sacrifice demonstrated Noah's gratitude to God for his protection and mercy throughout the flood. The significance of Noah's sacrifice is profound. In a world that had just been cleansed of sin and corruption, Noah's worship was an acknowledgement of God's justice, mercy, and grace. It was an act of faith, signifying that Noah understood the enormity of what had just occurred and his role in God's new plan for humanity. In response to Noah's offering, Genesis 8:21 tells us that the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma and declared, "Never again will I curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done." This promise reveals God's compassion and his commitment to preserving life, despite humanity's tendency towards sin. God's covenant with Noah. Following Noah's act of worship, God made a covenant with Noah, his descendants, and every living creature on the earth. This covenant was a divine promise never to destroy the earth with a flood again. In Genesis 9:8-11, God said, "I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth." This covenant was unconditional, meaning it did not depend on the righteousness of humanity. God acknowledged that the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth, Genesis 8:21. Yet he chose to extend mercy. This covenant emphasized God's enduring grace and love for his creation, even in the face of human imperfection. The sign of the rainbow. To seal this covenant, God set a visible sign in the sky, the rainbow. In Genesis 9:12-13, God said, "This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you, and every living creature that is with you, for all future generations. I have set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth." The rainbow was not just a natural phenomenon. It was imbued with deep symbolic meaning. The rainbow represented peace between God and humanity, a reminder that despite humanity's sinfulness, God's mercy would prevail. It also symbolized the beauty of creation after destruction, a visual reminder of God's faithfulness in the midst of judgment. The rainbow continues to serve as a powerful symbol of hope and God's promise, reminding believers that even in times of trial, God's grace is always present. Noah's family in the New World. After the flood, Noah and his family were tasked with repopulating the earth. God blessed Noah and his sons, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." Genesis 9:1. This blessing mirrors the original command given to Adam and Eve in Genesis 1:28, signaling a new beginning for humanity. However, the post-flood world was different from the world before. God gave Noah Noah's family in the New World. After the flood, Noah and his family were given the monumental task of repopulating and renewing the earth. The flood had wiped away much of the corruption, and they were stepping into a world that had been cleansed. God's first words to Noah and his sons after the flood echo the original command given to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden: "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." Genesis 9:1. This repetition signals a fresh start, a renewal of humanity's original purpose in the world, to multiply and care for creation. Noah's three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, became the ancestors of the new generations of people who would spread across the globe. From these three, the nations of the world would emerge. The genealogies listed in later chapters of Genesis trace the descendants of Noah's sons, establishing a link between the post-flood world and the rise of various civilizations, cultures, and languages. While the command to be fruitful and multiply marked a new beginning, the post-flood world was different in several significant ways. The flood had left an indelible mark on creation and humanity's relationship with God, one that would shape the way Noah's family interacted with the world and with each other. The post-flood covenant and changes to human life. God's covenant with Noah and his descendants included not only the promise to never again destroy the earth with a flood, but it also included new instructions that reflected the changed nature of the world. One of the most significant changes was God's provision for humans to now eat animals for food. Before the flood, humanity's diet had been plant-based, as indicated in Genesis 1:29, when God gave Adam and Eve every seed-bearing plant as their sustenance. However, in Genesis 9:3, God tells Noah, "Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything." This shift reflects the altered state of the world after the flood. While humans were now permitted to eat animals, there was also a specific prohibition. "But you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood." Genesis 9:4. This command showed that while animals could be used for food, there was still a sacredness to life itself, symbolized by the blood. Blood was seen as the life force of all creatures, and God required that life be treated with respect. Furthermore, God instituted new rules about the value of human life. In Genesis 9:6, God declares, "Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image." This statement reaffirms the sanctity of human life, grounded in the fact that humanity is made in the image of God. It introduces the principle of justice and accountability for murder, signaling that human life must be protected, even in this new post-flood world. The sin of Ham and the curse of Canaan. Despite the fresh start offered by the flood, human nature remained unchanged. Even after witnessing God's judgment and mercy, sin re-emerged in the life of Noah's family. One of the most puzzling and controversial episodes in the Bible occurs after the flood, when Noah plants a vineyard, becomes drunk on its wine, and lies naked in his tent. In Genesis 9:21-22, we read that Noah began to be a man of the soil, and he planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. Ham's reaction to his father's nakedness stands in stark contrast to the actions of his brothers, Shem and Japheth, who respectfully cover their father without looking at him. When Noah awoke and learned what had happened, he pronounced a curse not on Ham, but on Ham's son Canaan. "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers." Genesis 9:25. This curse, known as the curse of Canaan, has generated much debate and interpretation throughout the centuries. Some scholars suggest that Ham's act represented a deeper disrespect for authority or moral failure, which led Noah to curse his descendants. The significance of this event lies not just in the family dynamics, but in its foreshadowing of future struggles between the descendants of Noah's sons. The curse on Canaan is later connected to the Canaanite nations, who would eventually become enemies of Israel, the descendants of Shem. This incident illustrates that even in a world renewed after the flood, the consequences of human sin were still very real. Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the fathers of nations. The genealogies that follow Noah's story provide an outline of how humanity began to spread across the earth once again. Noah's three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, became the patriarchs of different nations, and their descendants populated various regions of the ancient world. Genesis 10, often called the Table of Nations, lists the descendants of these three sons and the regions they settled. Shem is traditionally associated with the Semitic peoples, including the ancestors of the Israelites, Arabs, and other Middle Eastern groups. His line is given special significance in the biblical narrative, as it is through Shem's descendants that the nation of Israel, and ultimately Jesus Christ, would come. Ham is associated with the peoples of Africa and parts of the Near East. Ham's descendants, including the Canaanites, Egyptians, and other African and Middle Eastern groups, would later play significant roles in biblical history, often as nations that interacted with or opposed Israel. Japheth is generally linked to the peoples of Europe and Northern Asia. His descendants are often seen as spreading further into regions that would later become the Greek and Roman civilizations, as well as other Indo-European groups. The division of humanity into these three broad groups is not just a matter of genealogy. It also reflects the growing diversity of cultures, languages, and civilizations that arose after the flood. The sons of Noah represent the branching out of humanity across the globe, each group playing a unique role in the unfolding story of the world. The legacy of Noah's family. Noah's legacy is not merely one of survival, but of renewal and the continuation of God's plan for humanity. Despite the flood, the corruption of the human heart remained an ongoing challenge. Noah's family, though chosen to preserve life, was not immune to sin and moral failure. However, their story shows that even after judgment, God's grace continues to guide the destiny of humanity. The command to be fruitful and multiply echoes throughout the biblical narrative, symbolizing the hope for a renewed humanity. Noah's sons became the forefathers of nations, and through their descendants, God's plan for the redemption of humanity would unfold. From Shem specifically would come Abraham, the patriarch of the Jewish people, and eventually Jesus, who would bring ultimate reconciliation between God and humanity. In this sense, Noah's family and the new world they entered serve as a microcosm of the larger human story. A world cleansed and renewed, but still marred by sin, in need of God's continued mercy and guidance. The Tower of Babel, the consequences of unity. Without God, the post-flood world seemed to be on a path to restoration. However, humanity's sinful nature soon reappeared in the form of pride and rebellion against God's authority. This rebellion reached its peak in the infamous Tower of Babel incident, which became a defining moment in the post-flood narrative and further developed Noah's legacy. Humanity, still united in language and purpose, decided to build a massive tower that reached the heavens. Their goal was to make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. Genesis 11:4. This act of defiance, of seeking to control their own destiny without regard for God's will, became the antithesis of Noah's humility and obedience. In response, God intervened, confusing their language and scattering them across the earth. Genesis 11:9. This dispersion marked the beginning of the world's diverse nations, languages, and cultures. The story of Babel reminds us that while human unity is a powerful force, when used in defiance of God, it can lead to judgment. The diversity of nations emerging from Noah's descendants is thus rooted in both blessing and divine correction. The ultimate legacy of Noah, a type of Christ. Noah's story is not just one of survival, but one that foreshadows greater themes of salvation in the biblical narrative. Many Christian theologians view Noah as a type of Christ, a figure whose life and actions prefigure the ultimate work of salvation brought by Jesus. Just as Noah's obedience led to the preservation of life and the continuation of God's covenant, Christ's obedience unto death brought eternal salvation to all who believe. The ark, too, is seen as a symbol of Christ. Just as the ark was the only means of salvation from the floodwaters, so too is Christ the only means of salvation from the consequences of sin. Those who entered the ark were saved, just as those who enter into a relationship with Christ are saved from the ultimate judgment. Noah's legacy, then, is one of faith, obedience, and renewal. His life demonstrates that even in the midst of judgment, God's mercy is present, and through faith, there is always the hope of new beginnings. The covenant God made with Noah points forward to the greater covenant made through Christ, who brings lasting peace between God and humanity, symbolized not.
Thanks for watching our latest videos by clicking on the video in the screen, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more.